Back in the Middle Ages, life ran on a system that shaped everything: feudalism. It might sound complex, but by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how this giant social pyramid worked. So, grab your imaginary swords and shields, and let's get started. First off, what even was feudalism? Picture this. It's the 9th century. The Roman Empire has collapsed, and Europe is a pretty chaotic place. There are no strong central governments, and Viking raids are a constant threat. People needed protection, and that's where feudalism comes in. It was essentially a massive deal-making system based on land, loyalty, and military service. Think of it as a social and political contract that held medieval society together. At the very top of this pyramid, we have the king. In theory, the king owned all the land in his kingdom. He was the ultimate authority, God's chosen representative on earth. But in reality, a king couldn't manage all that land by himself. He needed help to govern, to collect taxes, and most importantly, to raise an army. So, the king would grant large chunks of his land, known as fiefs, to his most trusted and powerful nobles. This brings us to our second level, the high nobility. These were the dukes, earls, and barons. They were the king's right-hand men. In exchange for their fief, they swore an oath of fealty, a solemn promise of loyalty and military support to the king. This meant they had to provide the king with a certain number of knights for his army whenever he called for them. These nobles were incredibly powerful, often ruling their lands like many, with their own courts, laws, and tax collectors. Next up, on the third level, we find the lesser nobles or vassals. The high-ranking nobles, just like the king, had too much land to manage on their own. So, they would divide their fiefs and grant smaller portions to lower-ranking lords. These lesser nobles would then pledge their loyalty and military service to the higher noble, not directly to the king. This created a complex web of loyalties. A single knight could be a vassal to one lord, who was in turn a vassal to a duke, who was a vassal to the king. It was like a chain of command, all held together by personal oaths. So where did all the soldiers come from? That brings us to level 4, the knights. Knights were the backbone of the medieval military. They were professional mounted warriors, clad in armor and trained in combat since childhood. In exchange for a small piece of land, enough to support themselves and their warhorse, a knight pledged to fight for his lord. The ideal of chivalric code of conduct emphasizing bravery, honor, and courtesy was central to a knight's identity, though how often it was practiced is a topic for another day. Now, we move away from the nobility and into a different but equally powerful part of the pyramid. The clergy. On level 5, we have the high-ranking church officials like bishops and abbots. The church was a massive landowner in the Middle Ages, often receiving land from kings and nobles. Because of this, bishops and abbots were often just as powerful and wealthy as the top barons. They managed vast estates, had their own vassals, and played a huge role in politics. They were the spiritual guides of society, but they also wielded significant worldly power. Beneath them on level 6 were the lower clergy, priests, monks, and nuns. Priests were the spiritual leaders in local villages and towns, responsible for the souls of the common folk. Monks and nuns lived in monasteries and convents, dedicating their lives to prayer and work. They were also the scholars and record keepers of the age. Monasteries were centers of learning, where ancient texts were painstakingly copied by hand, preserving knowledge through a very turbulent period of history. Alright, we're getting near the bottom of the pyramid. So far, everyone we've talked about from kings to priests made up a tiny fraction of the population, maybe just 10%. The vast majority of people belonged to the next 2 levels. Level 7 consists of the freemen. These were people who weren't tied to the land in the same way as serfs. They included merchants, artisans, and skilled craftsmen, like blacksmiths, carpenters, and stonemasons. They often lived in the growing towns and cities and had more personal freedom. A skilled blacksmith, for example, could travel and sell his services. Merchants formed guilds to protect their trade and became increasingly wealthy and influential as the Middle Ages progressed. Some peasants were also freemen, renting land from a lord and having the freedom to leave if they wished. Finally, at the very bottom of the social ladder, forming the foundation that supported everyone else, we have the serfs. This is level 8. It's crucial to understand that serfs were not slaves. They couldn't be bought and sold. However, they were not free either. A serf was bound to the land. They worked the Lord's Domatus personal land for a few days a week, and the rest of the time they worked their own small plots to feed their families. In return for their labor, they received the Lord's protection from bandits and rival lords. They couldn't leave the manor without the Lord's permission, couldn't marry without his consent, and had to pay various taxes and fees, often in the form of crops or livestock. Life for a serf was incredibly hard, dictated by the seasons and the demands of their lord. So, there you have it. The eight-tiered structure of feudal society. At the top, the king, who owned the land. Below him, the high nobles who received land from military service. Then the lesser nobles and knights who formed the military class. Alongside them, the powerful clergy, from bishops down to local priests. And supporting this entire structure were the freemen and, most numerous of all, the serfs, whose labor fed and funded the entire system. This system of feudalism dominated Europe for centuries, providing stability in a chaotic world. But it wasn't static. Over time, the rise of towns, the growth of a money-based economy, and events like the Black Death began to erode its foundations, paving the way for the modern nations we know today. It's a fascinating and complex topic, and we've only scratched the surface. What part of medieval life do you want to learn about next? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey back in time, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more history breakdowns. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.